Sulari Gentill's latest book is The Woman in the Library. She is also the author of the award-winning and best-selling Roland Sinclair Mysteries, the Greek mythology adventure series, the Hero trilogy, and she won the Best Crime Award at the Ned Kelly Awards for Crossing the Lines. Let's have a chat to Sulari Gentill. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sulari. Congratulations on your latest book, The Woman in the Library. Wow. On so many levels. For people who haven't got their hands on a copy yet, can you tell us what it's about?
It's an unusual book in that it has a kind of an odd structure. It's really a story within a story folded into the pages of a correspondence. So one facet of the story uh, is is the relationship between Leo and Hannah. The book opens with a letter from Leo to Hannah. He's an aspirant author who lives in Boston. Hannah is an established Australian author. He's an admirer and a fan, and in the beginning, he's everything any writer could hope for in a researcher. He's admiring, he's friendly, he's helpful. But as the novel progresses and the reader sees more of Leo's letters, and they do see one letter at the end of each chapter, they come to realize that there's something a little dark about Leo. That, for one thing, he seems to know an awful lot about murder.
Mm.
The other
Now,
fact, sorry,
no, please go on.
the other facet of the novel is, of course, the story that Hannah herself is writing in response to the advice she receives from Leo. And that story is centered around a young Australian writer called Winifred Freddie, who is in Boston to write her very worthy first novel. And she happens to be sitting in the Boston Public Library at a table with three strangers when a ragged scream rings out through the reading room, and everybody stops everything because they know that something terrible has happened. But when a search is conducted, there's nothing. There's no body. There's no reason for the scream. It's almost as if it came from nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. And that's the beginning of the mystery that Hannah is writing.
It is so clever. The way that you have structured this, the idea itself. How in the world did you come up with this idea?
Oh, look, that's a kind of an interesting story. I was writing another book entirely, and that book was also based in America. And I, of course, hadn't been to America in decades, and I'd never been to Boston. But I did have a friend of mine, an American writer, who was in Boston at the time working on his novel. And so I wrote to him, and I asked Larry if it would be okay if I picked his brain while he was there. And of course, in typical American style and generosity, he was saying, sure, anything I can do to help, happy to do so. But then I realized very quickly that Larry is a much, much better researcher than I am. So not only did he answer my questions, he started sending me maps and menus and weather reports. Then he started sending me photographs of the sidewalks so I could see how the snow plows knocked the snow up on this against them. And then one day there was a murder about 2 blocks from where he was staying. And he thought, Solari's a crime writer. She might be really interested in what an American murder scene looks like. And so he took himself off to the murder scene, and after the body had been removed, and he took footage of it and he sent it to me. So I'm in Australia and I get this email from Larry and I open it, and it's footage of a crime scene. And my husband happened to be standing behind me, and he said, gosh, I hope Larry's not killing people so he can send you research. And I'm 99% sure that he wasn't, but it did strike me as a really interesting idea for a novel. So I had to finish the novel I was writing at the time, so I kind of put it away. But I knew that the new novel would start with a letter, and it would be addressed Dear Hannah, and it would be written by Leo, and that's all I knew.
Wow. I love it. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the structure and the characters and the book, but I just would like to give people some context because you have written many, many books. Can you cast your mind back to before you had any novel published? Tell us what you were doing at the time and when it was it that you thought, oh, I really want to write novels.
Oh, okay. I was a lawyer, and I was working as a lawyer, and I was perfectly content being a lawyer. But I was one of those people that was a serial hobbyist. So I would pick up a hobby and do it really intensely for about 6 months. It was my life for 6 months. And then after 6 months after I'd mastered it, I'd sort of kind of get sick of it and move on to something else. And so, I have welded and stained glassed. I've made ceramic dolls. I've painted murals. I've built gardens like I was working in Babylon. Um, and I can even pregnancy test your cows because I had a
God.
period where I was going to raise miniature cattle. So, with all of this going on, I picked up writing in exactly the same way. I'd sort of finished the welding course. I was looking for something to do. And I thought, oh, I'll write a novel. And it was a novel because I thought that in my style, I would write a novel and then move on to the next thing. But once I started writing, it it was like I was breathing properly for the first time in my life. That
Wow.
And I knew very quickly that I wasn't going to stop. That was it. And it embarrasses me that it took me so long to learn how to breathe properly.
Wow. What was the part of it that was so rewarding for you? What aspect of writing made you feel like you could breathe properly for the first time?
It was just that it felt so natural, like this was what I was supposed to be doing. This is what my brain was designed to do. This is what all the idle daydreams about everything. I always had a tendency to look between facts and to look between stories. All of that made sense. And it seemed like I was actually just doing what I was supposed to have always been doing. It's really hard to describe. It was just like breathing properly. It felt natural. And it was all those aspects of living in your head, of making things up, of the kind um, of luxuriating in prose when it suited you, and of trying to manage all these threads so that it turned into something coherent. Every aspect of it was kind of wondrous, and there was this kind of creative explosion. And in the beginning there, I was writing books so quickly. It was as if they'd always been there and I was finally letting them loose.
That's incredible. Were you also a big reader at the time?
No, not particularly. I was a reader. I've always been a reader, but not a particularly big one. I still meet people who I'm in awe of with their reading prowess, their ability to read quickly and to contain the story. I'm a slow reader. I enjoy reading. I have always done it, but I would never call myself a particularly um, good reader in that sense. I think in some ways, I think the law destroyed me for reading, because the law teaches you to look at a paragraph and to hone in on the important bits, which is kind of counter to the way one reads a novel. You should luxuriate in every sentence. So it's really hard to turn that off once you've learnt it. And so, yeah, luckily for me, I think reading and writing are different muscles.
Yeah, definitely. Now, when you were saying you wrote your books fairly quickly, as if they were just already there waiting to come out, let's talk about this book. When did the idea form, and how long then did you let it brew? Well, I guess the idea formed when you got that
Yeah.
letter from Larry. Okay, so in that case, then let me ask: when you decided to put pen to paper for the first time, or fingers to keyboard for the first time, how long did it take then for the first draft?
It actually, the draft for this novel was a little bit broken up. So I remember that I began writing it in about December 2019. And of course, we all know what happened in
Yes.
2019. So we were in the middle of bushfires. I was writing it in evacuation, and then there was all the work after the bushfires to try and fix things, and then there was COVID. But I think I actually submitted it. It was still fairly quick. I think I submitted it to my agent by June.
Oh, that's still very quick. Yes, of course.
um, but for me, and that was just because it was broken up. It was a real pleasure to write. And when I actually found the time to sit down, it just came out. And it was almost like, I mean, my style is almost like discovering the story rather than writing it. It's like it's always there. I'm just unearthing it. It's a bit like an archaeological dig. So it's always very quick once I have begun. It just seems to be like the story is there, and I'm not actually doing a lot of work making things up. It's just there.
So if it was a book that didn't get broken up by a bushfire or a pandemic and a lockdown and whatever, how long would a book normally take you to write?
I normally give myself 12 to 16 weeks.
Right.
To get a draft that's worthy of sending on to an agent or a publisher.
Okay, so then with this, you say that it's a process of discovery. So presumably that means you don't know who, you have not unraveled the mystery yet, and it's there waiting to come out, which I think is fascinating that it seems to just pour out of you. Now, one of the things that you do in this book is that it's in the voice of the protagonist at the start of each chapter, and then it ends, I think, almost every chapter with a letter from Leo to Hannah. And
yep.
Did you decide that from the start? And how did you write that? Did you write it in a linear fashion, or did you write two stories kind of parallel?
Well, I'm an extreme pantser, so I don't plot at all. I've got no idea. So I had that concept, and I had this idea that the book would open with a letter. I had nothing else until I started to write. And I do write in a linear form. So I start with the first word of the novel, I end with the last word of the novel. I never write out of sequence. And so at the end of that first letter, then I was faced with, well, what comes next? And I remember thinking, should it be Hannah's reply? And then I thought, no, Hannah's reply should be the story she's writing. And it was at that time that I decided that you'd never hear from Hannah directly, that all you'd see was the story that she wrote in response to Leo's letter. And part of the reason that I did that was, for me, I think that you really can find an author, truly discover an author in their work. That's where you can see the most honest form of themselves. You can see what they love, what they dislike, what they value. You can see the kind of things that they admire in people, because it's in the characters that are there for people to admire. You can see the things that they worry about, the things that brings them anguish. So in some ways, the purest form of Hannah communicating with the reader was the story that she was writing in response to Leo. And I was hoping that by the end, because at that time I had no idea how it would go, that by the end of the novel, the reader would feel like they knew Hannah a little bit without ever hearing directly from her of how she responded to Leo.
So speaking of, getting to know the character, for the reader to get to know the characters, then when you say you're an extreme pantser, presumably that applies to your characters as well. Like, had you done any characterization of Leo or of Hannah, or do you discover them too as they appear on the page?
Yeah. So I've always thought that, characters don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of a plot. So yourself, as a human being, the character traits that come to come to the fore is dependent on the situation. So in
Mm.
certain circumstances, you may be hard-nosed and efficient, and in other situations, you may be romantic and kind of flaky, or and so on. So in a way, character doesn't exist independently of the actual story. So I allow that to develop organically as
Mm.
well. Because characters change and respond to what's happening around them and what you see of them, and the part of themselves that they show is dependent on the situation. And I think that's probably why crime fiction is has always been such a popular genre, because it is a story that puts people under real pressure, mortal pressure, where it's a
Mm.
life and death situation, and then you see how the characters behave in those situations, and so in some ways, I suppose it's a way of getting towards the true metal of a character by
Yes.
putting them in mortal danger. Um, so yeah, so there's in answer to your question, the characters develop in much the same way as the plot. It comes from somewhere. I unearth them as I watch them respond to the situations I put them in.
But do you try to hit any points like, like do you innately follow a three-act structure, or do you literally just write? Do you try to hit any particular kind of points or moments of conflict, or, consciously try to increase the stakes, anything like that?
No, no. Oh well, nothing. Occasionally, if I feel like the story has slowed, I use that old adage of, who was it, Elmore Leonard, that says, "Send in when the story slows, send in a guy with a gun, and it'll pick up." So I can do something similar quite often if I think the story is getting bogged, or this, or slowing down. I throw in another body, and that works quite effectively, because all of a sudden it focuses the mind and it focuses my mind as a writer as to explain how it all relates. It gives the reader a little jump start, and it also gives the characters a little poke and tells them to get on with it. So it's a little bit like that. My process is incredibly organic, um, and I have this interesting technique in that I don't just write. I write while I'm watching television.
No, no. I have never heard that ever in my
Oh,
life.
yeah. Look, and I suspect there's a few of us who do this, but we don't like to admit it because it looks like we don't care about our writing. We'll just dash off anything while we're watching television. But that's not why we do it. I used to be really ashamed of this process because I wrote best when I was watching television. But this, and I'd be really loath to admit it. But I was at the Emerging Writers Festival several years ago, and I was on with Kylie Ladd. So I'm not sure if you. So
Yeah.
Kylie is not only a wonderful writer, but she's a cognitive psychologist in her real life, and she actually gave me an explanation and a justification for this ridiculous process of mine. And she said, "No, Sulari, what's happening is that the creative center of your brain is in your prefrontal cortex." And apparently, it's very hard to access the prefrontal cortex directly. So that's why when you lose a word or you lose a name and you're trying to think of it, you can't. But then you go away and do something and it pops into your head. Well, I'm doing that, going away and doing something else and letting 90,000 words pop into my head. So it's so what the television does, and it's always something that's fairly mellow and predictable. So I watch a lot of BBC crime, lots of Midsummer Murders and Lewis and so on, which has a very distinct rhythm, and it probably occupies about 30% of my brain to watch that. And what it does is it distracts my conscious enough that the subconscious runs riot and writes the novel. And so what I expect is that there's something in my subconscious that's plotting everything, making sure that everything wraps up and making sure that all the threads are tied off. But it's just not bothering to tell the poor, beleaguered conscious part of my brain until absolutely necessary. And so it feels very much to me like everything's just being discovered because consciously I'm not aware of what's happening. That's my theory. Of course, I can't prove it.
I find that extraordinary. So, do you have the volume up so that you can hear what's going on, or is it just sort
Oh,
of white noise?
no. I actually follow the story.
Oh my
It's a murder I
God.
need to know, and so it's not. So
Now,
when I
how
say,
can you no, no, you need to explain this. Sorry. How can you follow the story while watching television? Like, I can understand following a story and then writing in the commercial breaks, or following the story and writing when, it's a cinematic scene or something like that. But at what points are you typing?
well, I touch type,
Yes,
so I don't actually need to look at the
sure.
um, and I must look at the screen and the television. So I recently I got reading glasses. So I had just got to the age where I needed reading glasses, and the optometrist said to me, especially when you're writing for long periods of time, your eyes are getting tired. Wear the reading glasses, but I don't. And the reason is I can't wear the reading glasses, which help me see the screen really clearly and see the television at the same time.
Mm.
So I must watch both at the same time, the screen and the television. And because I touch type, I don't need to watch the keyboard. So I don't look at it too closely because I'm afraid I'm going to break the magic. And I think that's the thing about writers' processes. We tell you what we think is happening, but I think there's always a dark part in the center of every writer's process that's still magic to us. We're not really 100% sure where these stories come from. So we give you a vague idea of what we think is happening. I don't try to dissect it. I take it as a gift. And that I can actually do this, and it may not. I've written 15 books this way. Book 16 might not work.
How did you discover it?
How did I discover? Well, when I started writing, my boys were really little. I had a 2 or 3 year old, and so the whole notion of having this quiet room in which to write just doesn't exist for mothers. So I would write in the midst of mayhem and chaos. And so I'd always be slightly distracted. The television was always on. They were always, jumping off the furniture or doing whatever. And we used to have this rule of, I'll just continue to write unless there's blood. If there's blood, I will stop what I'm doing and attend to it. So my boys grew up with that notion. And I don't know whether it's the same for all kids or all boys, but when they were young, they liked to have me in the vicinity, but they didn't need to interact with me so much. So I could keep a vague idea on what they were doing, making sure they weren't burning down the house or anything, but I could write. So I think I always started writing with that split attention. Never ever had the luxury of a quiet place. And I suppose that's where my technique developed. And once you seem to develop a technique, it's very hard to change it.
So when you were in the depths of writing a manuscript, like say during the 12 to 16 weeks that usually it takes you, how many hours a day? Because your boys are grown up now, so you have a bit
Yeah,
more,
yeah,
control over
yeah.
your own time. So what kind of discipline do you have in place? Do you start at a particular time? Do you have a routine? What does your day look like? And do you
Look,
have targets?
yeah. Look, the routine is kind of spasmodic. Years ago, when I was starting in the law, I had an older law student say to me, the only advice she could give me about studying law was to only study when I had done everything else I could possibly want to do, and the study would be more effective. So I've always sort of followed that process with writing. Um, I don't, I don't sit down to write if I don't want to. Luckily for me, I still want to all the time. It's the thing I like most doing. Part of the hassle is trying to make real life work with that, because every now and then you need to stop and feed children or let dogs out or answer the phone or answer the door. But if I had my way, I'd disappear into the book. That doesn't mean that it all just flows easily every time. There's some days are better than others. So generally when I'm in a full writing thing, I write at least 1,000 words a day, 1,000 good words. So permanent words a day. And sometimes that takes me 2 hours, and sometimes that takes me all day.
Yeah, right.
So if I find that if I can begin writing really early, it doesn't take me long. So that must be when I'm most creative, really early in the morning. But that doesn't always work, because people are getting off to work and people are getting off to school and things need to be done. And sometimes I don't sit down till 10 or 11 o'clock to start writing. And on those days, it quite often takes me, I'm still writing at midnight.
Wow.
So, but whatever it takes.
Yes. And so do you when you sit down to write, is that when you turn on the television and choose a show?
Yeah, I do. I turn on the television and I look for very specific type of shows. For some reason, there's something about BBC crime shows that seems to work in a nice rhythm for me. And I don't know what it is. It's mellow colors. They don't have a huge amount of car chases and all of that sort of, or gunfights. And I seem to be able to deal with that really easily. I couldn't watch anything that requires a heck of a lot of attention to follow. And I certainly couldn't watch something like The Bachelor while I was doing So it's very, and everybody's got to find their specific. Everybody's got to find their distraction level. I think all writers work with a lot of writers work with a distraction level. So I know there are some writers who need a darkened room and sit there and there's nothing but them on the screen. But there's other writers who listen to music, and they have tracks and so on for each book. Etc. And I can't actually listen to music for some reason. Music triggers a different part of my brain that makes my mind wander. But I can
That's
actually
extraordinary.
Yeah, I know, it's bizarre.
It's so bizarre. So with your author career, you've written 15 books now. Do you aim to write a certain number of books in a certain time period so that you structure your year accordingly?
Oh, there's nothing structured about my year.
Okay. I'm getting this sense, yes, about you and your life and your approach to life.
It just seems to, I think, a lot of writers are plagued with guilt, with this feeling that they should always be doing more and always be writing. And I've tried to avoid that notion. And this idea of, working to a timetable. And it seems to have worked for me. I've been at this 12 years and there's been 15 books published. There's been other books written, but there's been 15 published. So I seem to have a reasonable rhythm going forward. I don't, you can get very caught up in this business of feeling left behind, of feeling that, like other books are taking off more, making more sales, getting more reviews and more awards. And you have to actually, I think, for longevity, work at your own rhythm and your own place and letting your book be what it is, as opposed to comparing it constantly with the work of your friends. So I try not to get into these notions about who I want to be as a writer. I think about what I want the novel I'm working on at the time to be, what ambitions I have for that piece of work. And so I don't, but I tend to write, roughly 1 or 2 books a year.
And are you writing on your next one? Are you writing the next one already?
I've just submitted the next one.
Oh, okay.
And
Fantastic.
so I was having this wonderful conversation with my husband this morning, talking about the next one after that.
So you've
So
already thought of that?
it's again like the Larry idea. There's an idea. I have no
Mm,
idea what I can do with it, but there's that idea of where it can start. Um,
brilliant.
so I will just sit down and start writing one of these days. Um,
In front of the
and I,
television.
yeah, and I'm cautious. Like, I'm not starting it now because at the moment I'm doing a lot of interviews and I'm traveling a lot for the festivals and stuff. And I don't want to start when I'm going to have to stop every, regularly. So I'm just waiting for a little bit of a lull so I can just get going. And for me, it seems like if I get 10,000 words, the novel then writes itself. I don't really
Wow.
have to worry. It just doesn't. It seems to organically create itself. And but I need to get those 10,000 words uh, without too much breakup. So I need to be able to sit down and write 10,000 words without, having to stop for 5 days to go to this festival and stop for 3 days to go, or to turn my mind to something else. So I'm just waiting for a little bit of a lull to push this one off.
Sulari, I understand that you have a writing hut on your property, which is down in the Snowy Mountains, and you also have a artist hut, as in a hut for painting. You are a Renaissance woman. So first of all, tell me about the writing hut. Describe to me what it's like and what's it like inside?
Okay. So we live on a truffery, or we grow there's French back truffles on our house, on our property. The French back truffles grow on the roots of oak trees. So I have, in a couple of paddocks away from the house, a grove of oak trees, which are quite mature at the moment. They're beautiful. There's English oak trees. They're just gorgeous trees. In the middle of that, hidden, so that in the spring and the autumn and the summer, you cannot even see that it's there, is a little white hexagonal building. Oh, it's actually an octagonal building, and it's got windows all the way around and a set of doors. Um, and it's got a sort of a peaked roof. And on the top of that, on the top of the writing house, is a weather vane with a dog, which is a depiction of my old truffle dog Badger. Inside the writing house is there's a little kerosene heater in one corner. There's a green leather chaise lounge, because I like to write with my feet up. There is a beautiful oak bookcase against one wall, with books in it, and there's also a tin there with snacks for me and snacks for the dogs, in there. And there's a little, I think it's called a music cabinet, but it's basically a little cabinet with flat slats so that I slide manuscripts in there, and another armchair and extra blankets and so on, so that I can go in there and write. And if I'm there, nobody knows I'm home because you cannot see that it exists.
It
Uh,
sounds so romantic. It sounds absolutely idyllic. So then, tell me about the painting hut. You are also an artist. So what do you paint?
I have a preference. Oh, well, first I wouldn't call myself an artist, but I do paint. But I it's certainly not a claim I would take to the Archibalds, for example. But I do paint, and I have a preference for portraits. I've always been a portrait artist, and it's probably that made Roland Sinclair so easy to write, because I understand the way he looks at the world. So in my studio, there is a wingback chair, a green wingback chair. There's a carpet in the center. There is a cabinet against the walls which holds all my paints. There's another little cabinet on the other side which is full of pencils that sort of thing. There's two big artists' easels up against the windows with canvases against them, and my particular work in progress sitting on one or the other. Quite often, I have two on the go at the same time. Otherwise, the little artist studio is very similar to the writing studio. It's octagonal. It's got windows all the way around except for where the doors are. It's got one flat wall, which is where I put the bookcases or the cabinets, and it's got a lovely little peaked roof.
And how frequently do you paint?
This quite often actually. I live in a small country community, and I'm the art steward of the Batlow show. So at least once a year before showtime, I will get in and I will paint a lot to make sure that I have enough to contribute to the art show. But then periodically through the year, I will get the feeling, and I will need to paint. I find that because it's sort of using a different part of your brain, it loosens up my brain. If I've been writing intensely for a while, painting for a while actually just lets everything get back into balance and shake back into the place that it is. It's a bit like unclenching your mind. So I go in and paint for a while, and I paint very similarly to the way I write. I don't really plan anything. I just go in there and throw paint onto the canvas.
Brilliant. Well, The Woman in the Library, absolutely so clever, so well written. Now, let's end with, what are your top 3 tips for aspiring writers who would love to be in a position where you are one day?
Okay, top 2. One, the vast majority of our time as writers is not spent doing wonderful interviews or writers at writers' festivals. The vast majority of our time is lonely hours with the story. And I say lonely, but probably not lonely, alone with the story. You're never lonely as a writer because you've got people in your head. So you've got to find a way of writing that you can live with, that you can sustain, that gives you joy in and of itself. You can't control sales. You can't control publishers. You can't control what readers will think or reviewers. You can't control awards. That's all, up to fate, really, for a book. What you can control is whether you're getting joy from the act of writing. And if you can find a way to write that just gives you joy in and of itself, then you're ahead of the game. And for a career in writing, as opposed to just getting one book out, I think that is kind of necessary. Otherwise, you're letting yourself in for a lot of suffering. So that's my first tip. The second tip I would suggest is to try and work out what it is about your writing that you love, that you think is distinct, that makes your work unique. Take advice on everything else, but fight for that. And thirdly, I would suggest the thing that I have found that is really special about being a writer is the writing community, is making connection with writers, loving their books, supporting them, that whole sense of solidarity and community that you get in the writing industry. Writers are not in competition with each other. Nobody just reads one book. And quite often, people will see you with one writer, and if they love that writer, they'll read your book because you're in the vicinity. So take the opportunity to build that community, to be a part of it, because I think, much more than every other reward that comes with writing, that is a pretty special thing.
Wonderful. And on that note, congratulations on The Woman in the Library. So thrilled for you. Everyone, you need to get yourself a copy. Thank you so much for your time today, Sulari.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Valerie. It was a pleasure to talk to you.